The following program is brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org.
Welcome to Restoration Radio, Season 2. I am your host today, Stephen Heiner, and I am joined by His Excellency Bishop Daniel Dolan. Welcome, Your Excellency.
Oh, thank you very much, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
Pleasure is mutual, Your Excellency. Our topic today is the Chair of St. Peter, and we're recording this before your trip down to Mexico this weekend, Your Excellency. And I don't know if some of our listeners note that part of the reason that you were consecrated was to go on these mission trips down to Mexico. Can you tell us a little bit about this trip in particular, and then just briefly about your apostolate down there in general?
Oh, sure. Well, I studied high school Spanish at the minor seminary in Detroit, and always a little bit kept up my Spanish, and as a young Pius X priest, served a chapel in Miami area and had some occasion to work with the Cubans there, so that as time went on, I was usually able to hear confessions and do some business in Spanish. And at some point, as I got to know Bishop Pivarunas, he invited me to go with him to visit Mexico after the death of Bishop Carmona, and then it became maybe a logical thing that I could assist the priests there with the sacraments and the pastoral visits and so forth. So that was indeed one of His Excellency's ideas in asking me to be consecrated to bishop in 1993. And so I've been visiting Mexico at least once, if not twice a year, for 20 years now, actually longer than 20 years. And this visit takes me right across the border from San Diego into Tijuana, which actually was the first Mexican town I had ever visited when I was in California in '68, I think, as a young minor seminarian looking for a traditional seminary to go to, and I visited St. Michael's, the Norbertine Fathers in Orange, California, and then we went across the border to Tijuana, and boy, it was an eye-opener. It was really rough border towns. But I remember at the same time being impressed by it and by the devotion to Our Lady and the beautiful churches. So now there's a chapel in Tijuana, and the priest there, Father Villegas, invited me to come. They don't have a bishop at this time. They invited me to come then and visit them, spend the weekend with them, and give the sacrament of confirmation on Sunday. And it's a good occasion because it's the great feast of Epiphany.
That's excellent. Well, we are talking about another feast later this month. Of course, we've got the Epiphany. We've got the Epiphany coming up right before this taping.
Right.
But the Chair of St. Peter, what a uniquely Catholic. Are uniquely Catholic when we think about them. But when I think about this, I think about the back of St. Peter's, and you've got to get through all the other beautiful things in St. Peter's. You got to go all the way to the back, or the front, you could say. And in the back you have this Bernini designed piece of art that in a way summarizes the importance of this chair. I'm going to post a picture of this under Your Excellency. I'd love to hear your comments on the artwork and maybe the significance of that artwork tying to the feast, and then we'll probably start talking a little bit about the feast itself.
Okay. I certainly remember from my first visit to St. Peter many years ago how impressive that was, particularly when the sun comes through that glorious stained glass window of the Holy Ghost, and you can take in the whole of the breathtaking ensemble. It's, as you say, it's prototypically Catholic. in capital letters. And at the same time, the high point of Baroque art. Inside that magnificent bronze chair of St. Peter are the remaining relics, about 15 boards, of St. Peter's original chair that he had used, and which was used for about 15 centuries by his successors. They were, first of all, they were kept in a papal throne. Obviously, the thrones came and went, but the relics were transferred until finally they went into Bernini's reliquary. So it's really a reliquary, actually. And those 15 boards are bound together with decorative ivory, worked ivory bands. So on the one hand, it's a magnificent piece of Baroque art. Some have regretted that the popes, after Bernini, were no longer able actually to sit in that chair. It would be quite a feat to get yourself up there, I'm sure, and to manage to sit in there. But the spiritual symbolism remains and is certainly quite glorious. That reminds me of a story with which I would like to start, with your permission, Stephen. It's a story about one of the first European priests. There were some in France and some in Germany, to be expelled in maybe about 1980 or even before by Archbishop Lefebvre for holding that the chair is vacant, the position called sede vacantism. And he was a German priest, and Father Gunther Richter, rest in peace. He's since died. Father Richter was visiting some friends in the Minneapolis, St. Paul area in the early 80s, and was endeavoring to persuade a German lady about the sede vacantis position, when her husband, who did not hold the position at all, came home and was quite upset to hear what they were talking about that day. And he had brought a bouquet of flowers for his wife. And he actually sort of flew into a rage, and at a certain point he said, well, if we're going to be empty chair people, here, and then he put the flowers on an empty chair in the dining room. Let's all kneel down then and honor the empty chair. But unwittingly, this man actually touched in some sense a very, very important theme in Catholic art, Catholic life, and in Catholic worship, which means Catholic symbolism too, the idea that the chair of St. Peter, empty or occupied is another question, has always been honored by the Church, and that's what's at the heart of these feast days. We say these feast days because there is a feast day of in the traditional missal, the feast day of St. Peter's chair at Rome on the 18th of January, and his chair at Antioch on the 22nd of February. I say it was a question of honoring the chair, and in a sense that's true. And it seems, from what I've read, that there were always those who were afraid that, especially the simple people, would carry the devotion to the actual chair or one of his chairs of St. Peter a little bit too far. And these feast days were always connected with then the veneration of relics and the simple devotion of the faithful. They say that probably the earliest occurrence of honoring the chair of St. Peter was in the cemetery on the Via Nomentana in Rome, and that goes back to about the 3rd or maybe the early 4th century. And this chair was actually carved out of it's called tufa, T-U-F-A, the volcanic rock that's found in the catacombs of Rome. And the faithful and pilgrims from all over would come, and they would honor that chair because it was a chair that St. Peter had used, it was traditionally believed, for offering some of his masses and for some of his sermons. It was his throne as the Bishop of Rome. And they're burned in front of this chair in the catacomb lamps with perfumed oil. And what the pilgrims would do, we did dip a little piece of cloth or of cotton, like a cotton puff, into the oil and take it back home with them after they made their devotions, and they would keep it as a precious relic. That's interesting because that's always been a way for Catholics of venerating holy articles, and at the same time maybe of keeping some kind of a keepsake. You may know that today, for example, still today it's common, as has been throughout the centuries in the Church's life, for maybe the sick to be blessed with oil that had been in a lamp burning either before the Blessed Sacrament or, say, before an image of the Holy Face or a miraculous image of Our Lady. And people would do the same thing. They'd put a little cotton into the oil, and then they would take the oil and then use it to anoint a sick person. So that's an interesting thread that's gone all the way through. But my reading is that there was some controversy about honoring this chair because it was felt that maybe some of the simple faithful got a little bit maybe superstitious or excessive in their devotion, and that some church authorities over the centuries wanted to see this particular devotion suppressed. But they were never successful with it, even though for many centuries there really wasn't any one uniform feast of honoring St. Peter's chair. Nevertheless, the Vatican chapter itself in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome always recited the office and always celebrated the Mass on the 22nd of February for St. Peter's chair. There was a little controversy, too, between the chair that was honored in the catacombs in Rome and between the chair that we've just now spoken of, the wooden chair, whose relics are now enshrined in Bernini's reliquary in the apse of St. Peter's Basilica. It was a wooden chair, and there was also a wooden altar that was used, and those are signs of really authenticity, because the Pope would have to, St. Peter, and then the popes after him during the persecution, would offer Mass, usually in a private home. And these portable articles, a chair, a small altar, could be moved from place to place, and then that would be convenient, and that would really work for the times of the persecution. So how do we end up with the two feast days of St. Peter's chair, and why was it that the modernists who were composing what we call the John the 23rd Missal suppressed the feast day on the 18th of January? There are a couple of theories about that, but it seems likely that the feast of St. Peter's chair on the 18th of January comes, of all things, from a Gallican or a French liturgical source. I say of all things because when you hear the word Gallican, you think right away about the efforts under the somewhat less inglorious French kings, including the Sun King, Louis XIV, to remove and to moderate and to control, in some sense, the true papal prerogatives, the prerogatives of the Pope in France. But this takes us back centuries before, when there was in the Catholic Church this sense that Lent is such a great serious fast that one should not keep any feast days during Lent. And that's probably the origin of the Feast of St. Peter's Chair on the 18th of January. The Gallicans, and then eventually that came to Rome, the Gallican Church early on fixed that date so as to have the Feast of the Papal Primacy, which is what we're talking about here, the Papal Primacy in January instead of in February, because in February, as will be the case this year, it would fall during Lent, and that was considered that just wouldn't be possible. But as I say, pretty much the feast day either in February outside of France and maybe Rome, and then the January feast, they pretty much fell into desuetude. They weren't observed in any sort of a strict or regular fashion for many, many centuries, until we get to the glorious Pope Paul IV, who in 1558 decided that he would restore the Feast of St. Peter's Chair and make it obligatory for the whole church. And that's where we get the Feast of St. Peter's Chair at Antioch from, that because there were two dates for St. Peter's Chair, then the Holy Father decided to fix one to honor the fact that wherever the Pope is, why then he indeed has his chair. That is a chair. I guess I should have started out by saying that chair means the cathedra, the teaching office, the authority of the Pope. So the authority of the Pope as Vicar of Christ rested in Antioch, Syria, for a while, and then it was moved finally to Rome. So he kept both dates, which because there were in the church different places and times, there are traditions of 2 dates. So he kept both dates, but assigned the more ancient Roman date to Antioch and the French date to Rome. And so that's how we get the 2 dates.
And it's interesting you brought up cathedra, Your Excellency, because obviously some of our listeners may not make that connection that chair means cathedra.
Yes.
Most Catholics, when you say ex cathedra, that's probably the American pronunciation.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
They know what that means, but they don't necessarily think of, everyday household item, chair, cathedra, and when you think of 2 chairs here, when you go into any church, I think of occupied territory, really. If you go into these cathedrals that are currently occupied by modernists, you'll see a cathedra. Sometimes it's the traditional one. Sometimes it's some newfangled, looks very uncomfortable to sit in chair.
Right.
And you, as you refer to, that represents the teaching office. So in a way, if we think of sort of the big mythos of St. Peter's chair, when we think of simply a bishop's chair, that to us represents teaching. It represents magisterial authority.
Exactly. And the chair itself represents that. And herein lies an interesting little factoid. Everything that's used in the Catholic Church properly, according to the rubrics, has a certain symbolism or a distinct meaning. Actually, it's forbidden to have a chair in the Catholic Church, in the sanctuary, in the clergy's domain, as it were, except the chair, the cathedra, the throne for the bishop, because a full chair, that is to say with backs and with arms, is a symbol of teaching authority. And the classical way for a bishop to give his sermon would be seated with mitre and crozier on his throne, his cathedra, where we teach there, and the same thing, of course, for the Pope. What the lesser clergy are meant to use is some form of a stool. So, for example, when I celebrate a pontifical Mass, I use an elaborate form of a stool called a fold stool, but it has no back. It's a stool. And the symbolism is clear. I'm not a bishop with ordinary jurisdiction. I'm not the bishop of a diocese. I am a bishop in extraordinary circumstances. I guess you could call me, to use their new lingo, an extraordinary bishop, right? Some people might agree, some people might disagree with that. But in any case, I certainly don't enjoy ordinary jurisdiction. Everybody would pretty much agree with that one. And so I don't use the throne or the chair. Other traditional bishops do, but they really shouldn't. Their symbolism means something. In the old days, sometimes the purveyors of church goods would sell the reverend pastor a sedilla. It's called a sedilla, the seats, the little seats, literally, that look like a chair. And sometimes that's actually what you see. And I always cringe whenever I see a chair in a Catholic sanctuary, because unless it's a choir stall, then you're thinking of a chair, and then you've got the wrong symbolism there. So the Catholic Church, we have symbolism, and all the symbolism really matters. A good example of that is the priest hearing confessions. He hears confessions seated. Why does he hear confessions seated? Where is he sitting? Well, he's sitting in some form of a chair. And then he can, because he enjoys, for that moment, he enjoys jurisdiction. and he is going to open or close the gates of heaven. He's going to judge. He performs an act of jurisdiction to judge whether or not the penitent, as far as he knows, is well disposed and worthy to receive the sacramental absolution. So he's seated in a chair. So all of the little things matter. To reduce the whole, you might say, theology of the chair to the ex cathedra, as our American brethren would say, is a real shame. But that's what they do. And when they do that, it's the Gallican work, that is to say, the work of reducing the authority of the church, the authority of the successors of Peter. That's another story, but that's a very, very bad thing. But back to the chair. Things are supposed to symbolize. In the Catholic Church, something that is used has a symbol, has a specific and an exact symbol, and we Catholics should know about it, and then we should try to respect it. So when we say the Feast of St. Peter's Chair, what we're really saying is the feast of the primacy of St. Peter. And we're honoring him as the Bishop of Rome, and that's because St. Peter and his successors are the bishops of Rome. Then, therefore, they are the vicars of Jesus Christ upon earth. So that's really a very strong meaning of the feast. There's another very little-known feast, or rather observance, not actually a feast, but it's an observance, which marks the day, traditionally, on which St. Peter first set foot in Rome. And that's the explanation for what we call the Greater Litanies, or the Litanies of St. Mark, on St. Mark's Day on the 25th of April each year. This is a beautiful Catholic observance that's unfortunately pretty much died out, but it's meant to be observed with the chanting of a litany of the saints in procession. And they say that the origin of that on that day, only later on, was the day given over to St. Mark. But the 25th of March was the day on which St. Peter first entered into the city of Rome. So actually, we Catholics have in our unchanged missal 3 distinct days or observances to honor this awesome truth of St. Peter, possessed of the authority of the Prince of the Apostles, founded in the Gospel text itself, St. Matthew, to as Petrus, as you can read in the great cupola over the altar of St. Peter's, thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. That's a little bit of the history of all of that.
And, Your Excellency, I want to backtrack for a minute to your talking about the importance of the things having meaning within the Catholic sanctuary, because sometimes, as Catholics, we'll do the wrong thing, and anyone can see from any, let's say, pontifical mass that sometimes the Master of Ceremonies has to move someone here into this position and there into that position. There's a reason why they're being moved there. There's a reason. There's a gospel side. There's an epistle side. And we do these things because we want to do them right, not just because we want to muddle through. So you were referring to the fact that some traditional bishops don't observe the faldstool. They'll celebrate pontifical mass at the throne. I thought it'd be worth visiting this particular phenomenon within the Pius X Society, that this is an artifact of Archbishop Lefebvre, and some people don't necessarily know about this, that obviously you have a particular connection, devotion to the bishop who consecrated you, and you follow his customs sometimes, but the problem is that privileges that were granted to the archbishop obviously did not pass down to his bishop. So the archbishop actually had an episcopal seat and retained, correct me if I'm wrong, Your Excellency, he retained the ability to celebrate Mass at some sort of throne because he had an episcopal see at some point.
No, what happened? Actually, what happened, Stephen, is that he was given a privilege as a result of an honorary position called the Assistant to the Pontifical Throne. Father Cicada reminisces visiting Archbishop Lefebvre in the 80s for some sort of an anniversary. Maybe it was just the anniversary of the founding of the Pius X Society, but he went over to Switzerland really kind of the last minute, and the Archbishop was in sort of a mellow mood. It was just a small group of priests that were there for the celebration. And at some point after dinner, went back to his room and got out a box with all of his memorabilia in there, and he showed Father Cicada and the others this papal bull that made him to be an assistant of the pontifical throne. So one of the personal privileges he had was to pontificate at the throne wherever he was, which usually is a privilege given only to cardinals. So it's not really given to Pius X Society bishops. I want to make that clear. But their idea is, yeah, that's right. But their idea is that they're sort of baby Archbishop Lefebvre's, and so if Monsignor did it, then that would be all right for them to do too. But it's not true at all. It's a privilege that was personal to the Archbishop, and it died with him. In the old days, a visiting bishop, an extern bishop or an auxiliary bishop, we would say, who was not the bishop of the diocese, had no right to pontificate at the throne unless he received permission from the bishop of the diocese, which sometimes was given and then sometimes it was not given. So there's a symbolism there. And more and more traditional bishops nowadays are using the throne, and maybe they've got some way worked out to justify that, but I don't think it's proper to do that. And the symbolism is a beautiful one that we bishops today who are left in this terrible crisis of the Church, who don't have ordinary jurisdiction, we content ourselves with using the false dome.
Well, and Your Excellency, while we're on the subject of jurisdiction, we're talking about symbols and we're talking about the proper way to do things. I've also often sometimes seen people improperly genuflect when kissing a traditionalist bishop's ring, but this is actually not proper, correct?
No, it's not proper, and it's almost in bishop's defense, since I'm one myself, I'll say that it's one of those things that's almost impossible to get people not to do, and so at some point you just sort of genteelly give up. But the proper greeting for a bishop is you should really kiss his ring. You shouldn't shake his hand, number one. We're not, French revolutionaries or something, or American Democrats. And you shouldn't kneel down, because the kneel down in this context is a sign of the jurisdiction of the office, that the bishop has got his throne, his cathedra, his teaching office, and that he enjoys ordinary jurisdiction through the Pope from our Lord himself. And that's what you're really venerating. There was a distinction that was made, and it's a liturgical distinction, that when one genuflected to the bishop, one genuflected on the left knee, and to the altar or the Blessed Sacrament using the right knee. That was another sort of a fine distinction that was made. But you're really supposed to just bow and then kiss the bishop's ring, and really nothing more than that. And it would be the same thing when the bishop blesses. Bishop's encouraged, because he can, to give lots of blessings, and he gives these little signs of the cross as he moves through a church. Say, well, technically the correct thing to do is simply to receive that with a bow, but because of custom, and as we say, custom contrary to law, a lot of people will end up kneeling down. The problem always is the older people who kneel down and they can't get up again, and then it's your job as a bishop to kind of haul them up, which can be quite a procedure at times.
That must fall under the fishers of men category, Your Excellency.
That's very good, Stephen. I'm sure you're right.
You're reaching down to pull up the net. This is why I wanted to give you that context and opportunity to correct people, because I'm sure you get tired of, no, you can't do that, no, you can't do that, and then afterwards just throw your hands up and say, okay, whatever you want to do.
That's right, but that's all right. And that too is somehow that spirit is not exactly okay, whatever you want to do, but somehow a little bit of that spirit really does have to inform and inspire, which, I guess for want of a better term, I would say a working bishop. There's a true Catholic bishop who has nothing to do with the new false religion of Rome. that there has to be this sense of understanding and accommodation to people, and the realization, at least once a day, that, wait a minute, we're living in extraordinary times. Most people are just really doing the best that they can, and you have to be as accommodating as possible here.
Right, absolutely. Well, in talking, we use the term modernist occupiers a lot in this show so far, Your Excellency. Some people may not know that you, the younger version of you, wrote an article doing a side-by-side of the Pius X and the John the 23rd missiles, which is something I'd love to have another show on at some point. But you can find it on traditionalmass.org, and I'm about to put a link to that on Twitter. I've also put a picture of the Chair of St. Peter by Bernini. I've also put that on Twitter. If anyone listening has any questions that they'd like to submit to His Excellency, you can do so. Our Twitter handle is @TrueRestoration, so you'll find the links to His Excellency's article and the picture of Bernini's chair there. But the point that I was trying to make, Your Excellency, is you one of the things, I think it's point 16 in your side-by-side showing, is the abolition of the feast of St. Peter's chair in Rome. Why was it so? I mean, there's a bunch of other beautiful feasts as well, including the changing of St. Joseph, patron of the Universal Church, to St. Joseph the Worker, or as I've heard it called, St. Joseph the Communist.
Yes, indeed.
So
indeed.
we have St. Peter's chair in Rome abolished. Why is it important to abolish this feast?
Well, the modernists had set themselves a principle of avoiding. In fact, the term is actually used in Sacrosanctum Concilium in the Vatican II decree on the sacred liturgy, that useless duplications were to be avoided. And so the modernists would dismiss these two venerable traditions, which had grown up in the church for, as we discussed earlier, for all sorts of interesting, historically and then spiritually too, reasons. The modernists say, "Oh, you don't need two for this." Right, St. Peter's chair, one feast. 22nd is obviously the older of the two and the authentic. That's what we're going to stay with that one, and the other one we will abolish. But the whole history of the feast is of such interest and such importance, and the fact that in 1558 Paul IV decided that he did want to honor the stay of St. Peter at Antioch in Syria before he moved on and entered into the eternal city of Rome. There's a living history there, and besides, as we well know, human nature, we learn by duplication, we learn by repetition. So it's a little bit the same thing, and you'll find that in that same article that I did years ago about the abolition of the octaves. Why is it important that we should observe octaves? These feast days are not of a rank to admit of octaves, but St. Peter and Paul's feast, June 29th, has an octave. So does Epiphany. Epiphany is really one of the greatest feast days of the year. But these feast days have all lost their octaves. Octaves give us the opportunity for 8 days in a row to meditate on, to go back to the same theme, to hear about it again, to think about it, to honor it, so that we can really live what the liturgy has to offer us during these days. And of course, there's a symbolism there too. The number 8 is the number of eternity. There are 7 days in the week, 7 days of creation, and the 8th is the day of the resurrection. It's the day of eternity. So when we keep a feast for 8 days, we say that symbolizes our desire to keep the feast one day in heaven, when there will be no passage of time anymore, when it is indeed the ever-present now. So you have a rich history that we've been developing a little bit today, Stephen, of these two parallel feasts, and all sorts of interesting truths, as well as realities just about human nature itself, you might say. And then with one swipe of the pen, the feast of St. Peter's chair is abolished. But it's curious and a very ironic fact, however. While the feast of St. Peter's Chair in Rome, January 18th, was abolished, or maybe you might say transferred to the February 22nd observance, and then Antioch was abolished, nevertheless, it is still observed in a sense by modernist Rome, as the Pius X people would say, and observed really throughout the world. The 18th of January is the opening day of what's called it used to be called the Chair of Unity Octave, when it was an indulgence devotion in the Catholic Church, and now today it is the week of prayer for Christian unity. So you will see Ratzinger or some other character like him with all of his cardinals and bishops and monsignors and as many non-Catholics as they can possibly get in one place, and they all go to usually I think St. Paul without the walls in Rome, and they'll have a big observance on the 18th of January to start this. Well, it started as a week of prayer for the return of the dissidents and the non-Catholics to Rome, and that was, as I say, an indulgence devotion. It's an interesting history itself. But they're still observing that date, in other words, in some sense. And the reason they're doing it is because it has touched the sacred wire of ecumenism. And anything that has any ecumenical potential at all is to be unchanged, left in place, honored, and deeply respected. Father Cekada, in his book, Work of Human Hands, about the New Mass, makes that point more than once, that certain features of the traditional liturgy were retained simply because of an ecumenical note. And then the modernists, of course, always are ecumenists before everything else.
Mm. And I'm thinking about, the relation of tradition to modernity as you're talking, actually, and it's sort of there's sort of a geographic commentary on the present, that when we think about Antioch, this once great episcopal see, that now it's obscured within modern day Turkey. It's all but gone, and we can think about not only the providential purpose of Rome, that our Lord knew that Rome would be there, and that it would be a place to preserve not just this feast, but all sorts of other things within the church. But that also, too, in a way, that Antioch can sort of stand in the stead for those of us who, understand the crisis in the church not to be something that we simply arbitrate, pick and choose what, what we consider a man to be pope. We don't get to pick and choose what he says, but that for us, perhaps it's a bit more of an Antiochian experience than a Roman one for now, because I can go to Rome and it looks like everything's fine. If I go to Antioch, I have to see with the eyes of faith, don't I?
Yeah, indeed you do, because everything is in ruins. But of course, in Rome at the same time, you can see, especially during the week of prayer for Christian unity, or the Assisi times, you can see how, spiritually speaking, the Eternal City really is a ruin. It's a disaster, a shipwreck, the bark of Peter, a shipwreck, which takes me to the point that how can you keep one, or if you're following the modernist missal, one, or if you're following the traditional missal, rather, two, of these feast days of the primacy of St. Peter, how can you keep those feast days without actually believing in the primacy of St. Peter? I often ask myself that, and the people say, well, of course I believe in the primacy of St. Peter. He's the Pope, and we pray for him, and then, of course, if he speaks ex cathedra on those really rare occasions, well, then we have to obey him and abide by what he says. But aside from that, we'll go with our particular guru or leader or bishop, whatever. He'll tell us whether or not we're supposed to obey this or that thing that comes from St. Peter's See. And how different that attitude is, which is simply a schismatic attitude, how different that attitude is from anything even remotely Catholic. The great Bossuet, for example, the wonderful French bishop and orator, who did have a little bit of Gallicanism in him, truth to tell, gave beautiful sermons for the Feast of St. Peter's Chair on the 18th of January, in which he so very highly extolled the primacy of St. Peter. But that is a truth that's almost gone. It's almost abolished and done away with. How sad that is. I think that today you can say, Stephen, that we breathe an air of schism. Father Faber talks about the danger in 19th century England of breathing the air of heresy. That's understood, heresy and apostasy. But in our own midst, where we think that we're safe, with our own periodicals or websites or friends, or some certain people at the masses or the sermons they attend, there's an air of schism that is not just lingering in the air, but it's breathed in, it's inhaled deeply. And everyone lives that way. That is to say that people don't really have a concept that Peter could never fail, that Peter could never lead us wrong, that the church could never give us anything bad, wicked, or evil, or harmful to Catholic truth. That simply could not happen. That all of that doctrine is lost. So when they talk about the Romans and negotiating with the Romans and the Pope this and the Pope that, criticizing and accusing him, how can they keep these feasts, these glorious feast days of St. Peter? And while many so-called traditional Catholics do indeed say the traditional Mass, and they put in the name of, in this case, Benedict XVI or Ratzinger into the canon of the Mass, nevertheless, they don't do it with the idea that they actually are going to be submitted to him, because they may have very well have opened up their churches, or as one of the church fathers has, set up their altar in opposition to another altar, the altar of the ordinary of the place, the bishop of the diocese. They're there without jurisdiction, without permission. So when you talk about the primacy of St. Peter, when you talk about these feast days, you get into the heart of the error that infects the traditional Catholic movement. And the tragedy, I think, is this. I think that you have to say, with a sincere desire to save the Catholic faith, these leaders and their followers have mutilated the Catholic faith in order to change it. That is to say that the whole idea of the supremacy of the Petrine office and jurisdiction is just gone now. That's not there anymore. Or the fact that the Pope could never teach error to the whole church. As a private doctor, maybe he could make a mistake on a theological point, but he could never teach the whole church error. And everybody says that all of these popes, all the way through for decades and decades now, have taught error, and therefore they have to be resisted. So I would call upon anybody and everybody who's going to keep the feast on the 18th of this month or the 22nd of next month to consider these. Do a little reading. Consider these things. Read the texts themselves from the Missal. Go back and read the Catechism. Read some of the saints and some of the sermons of the Fathers of the Church, and understand that this would be impossible. I could read you a little something from Cardinal Schuster. I was doing some research with him this morning in preparation for our radio show. He says, the pontifical primacy is the polar star which guides the bark of the Church across the treacherous and stormy ocean of time. Bishops, patriarchs, entire nations, once glorious and believing, have many times made grievous shipwreck of their faith. And indeed, the Scriptures tell us that in the last era of the world, many false prophets and pseudo-Christs shall appear, who will endeavor to mislead the multitudes, even by the example of their own false faith. Very interesting, and of course, very, very powerful writings, and that's just something that I picked up almost at random. Working false miracles, the Cardinal continues, to confirm their errors. If then we cannot trust anyone, this is the part that really hit me, if we cannot trust anyone, since all are liable to err, from whom must we seek safety in the supreme matter of our eternal salvation, if not from Peter, His faith, as we know, on the testimony of our divine Redeemer himself, can never fail. And the sheep which Peter recognizes as belonging to his fold will be recognized and admitted as such also by Jesus Christ, the chief shepherd. Another writer, a bishop, actually refers to masses in which, when there's a true pope, the true pope is not prayed for, as being an incomplete sacrifice. But I think you have to take that in the whole sense, not only mentioning the name of the man, but actually being in communion with him, union with him, in submission to him. Very, very important points. So you see why, that takes us back to the idea, why 2 feasts? You see why we have 2 feasts. We should have, and actually 3 observances if you count St. Mark's Day and the procession, and then 4 if you count St. Peter and Paul in June and then their octave. It's important. We talked about this theme a little bit in our show for Christ the King. Pope Pius XI says the best way to keep the faithful aware, to educate them about the great truths of Catholic doctrine, is not by some dry teaching tool, but by means of feast days. So what a glorious thing. But it's not going to do you any good to keep these feast days as sort of an empty letter. I think our Catholic faithful, our Catholic bishops, our Catholic priests have to forget about party or political considerations and have to expel the schism from their lungs and have to get back into the real Catholic teaching about these points and get it straightened out again, which would maybe take me back to my story at the top of the hour, as they say, about Father Richter and the empty chair. If the chair is not empty, well, then that means that the man who's in it is teaching the truth to all of Christendom. And that's the bark of Peter, and that's the rock on which our faith rests. But if everybody is saying, wait a minute, that's not possible, that's not even Christian, well, then the reason for that is that he is not the successor of Peter. There you have it. That's obviously my own perspective on things. But I do think that these things matter.
Well, and I think you've also showed that the people who are in, we would classify them as the recognized and resist crowd. They're sort of in between a rock and a hard cathedra, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, yes.
Because if these men aren't popes, the alternative, if you're believing that they are, is that we have had a whole slew of saints, blessed, quote unquote, blessed John. I mean, it's humorous just to say that out loud. Actually, blessed John the 23rd. I can't say that without laughing. Apparently,
right.
Paul VI as well soon, and then we also have Santo Subito.
Yeah,
we have Santo Subito John Paul II.
Right, and Paul VI is the servant of God now. Paul VI. Well, that's a stretch. Everybody knows that's a real stretch, from many different perspectives. So then you get someone who's going to say, oh, well, the canonizations really, really, really aren't infallible, whereas we well know that they are indeed an exercise of the Church's infallible magisterium, and there'd be some way to weasel out on all of this stuff. But look at the sacred scripture, look at the fathers of the Church, look at the Catechism, look at the sacred liturgy and the unchanged missal. There isn't any weaseling out of all of this stuff. You have to say, oh, I'm a schismatic, aren't I? Yeah. And that's, of course, that realization, which is a highly unpleasant one, which would really wake you up if you were sleeping, maybe. That realization, unfortunately, regularly drives not only faithful, but even priests into the conciliar church. I heard about an Australian Pius X priest just around Christmas time, Father Arthur by name, who wrote a really very nice, respectful letter to Bishop Fellay, in which he had to resign from the Pius X Society. And he said, I've just got to be as conservative as I can as a diocesan priest, but the bishop is going to accept me, because it's impossible otherwise. And that's the point. It's impossible otherwise. So really you might say that the only way the whole R&R position can exist aside from the fact that it appeals immensely to the have your cake and eat it too crowd, the only way that can exist is that you make a dead letter of the Catechism, the Fathers of the Church, the Scripture, and the liturgy. These all are a dead letter. And you're doing that like in the name of honoring the memory of one dead archbishop, for example, or one, really big, powerful, well-organized, traditional movement that seems to kind of have it together. It's just, but, what shall a man give in exchange for his own soul? How sad. And how can you save your soul outside of Peter's Park? I mean, I don't see it myself. I really don't. So the feast days, these celebrations, they're a call every year for Catholics to hold a logical position about these things, and not in effect to wake up one night and find themselves, wait a minute, I'm a schismatic, aren't I? Yeah, you are. But your answer is not going to be, you're not going to save yourself by going into apostasy, the one world religion. You'll save yourself by adopting a clear, logical Catholic principle about this.
Right, and I think that probably as we're getting towards the end of our show, Your Excellency, it takes us back to the beginning where we were talking about that Bernini piece and actually your story about the empty chair. Is that I'm sort of revisiting my own feelings. The very first time I laid eyes on that piece of art, I was 20, and I was still figuring out. I was still trying to work out what had happened. I had only learned about the traditional Mass a couple years beforehand, and I was still putting together the pieces. So for me, when I saw that piece of art, I connected it to that feeling of, I'm Catholic and I'm in St. Peter's, and the church is so glorious. And I was in Rome a couple years ago, and a profoundly different feeling, obviously being back there, still being bowled over by its beauty, but there being a sort of profound sadness as I saw people walking around, and I thought, well, they're never going to get to see a real Mass right here. The sort of Masses that were celebrated that's a privileged altar back there, and the sort of sadness that there's some of us who get to see with the eyes of faith that unfortunately the church, the positions of authority in the church are occupied by modernists. But the Catholic position is not to say, well, they are still bishops, but only when I feel like it. It's like clearly these men are either bishops or they're not. They're either the holders of Catholic authority or they're not. There's no when I feel like it on Tuesdays.
That's right. No, it's impossible.
Especially that Tuesday happens to be the feast of the Chair of St. Peter. So when we look at this feast, I think a lot of times we always have reflection points for traditionalism, but in a lot of ways, this feast, and we're tying it together with another show that we're doing this month that one of my co-hosts, Dr. Pierre Tujo, will be doing with one of the CMRI priests about a Father, I think it was Father Faber article on devotion to the Pope. And this idea is like, well, what's real devotion to the Pope? What does that mean? Is that just something? So we sing a song at the end of benediction. Does that mean that we're devoted to the Pope, or that we actually follow what we say, what he says, as opposed to what we say is okay for him to say?
Yes, exactly. Oh, yes, that's so very true. So that. You think of that quote from Pope St. Pius X. This is what the Pope demands of you. You actually obey me. You do what I say. So how can we justify this whole ecclesiastical system, carefully elaborated, powerful, spread throughout the whole world and growing, which ignores the Pope? So it's schismatic. It's not a Catholic. Say what you want about it. It is not a Catholic entity. It can't possibly be, because it ignores the Pope. It says that he's the Pope, but we can ignore him, and that teaches falsehood to our children. That's really a very, very bad thing. So these are. I remember my visits to Rome, especially my visit after I was consecrated a bishop. That there's a feeling of glory and of devotion and of history and of pride for being a Catholic, but at the same time, there's such a sad feeling that you think all of these posts are occupied by modernists, and the chair of Peter, the cathedra of doctrine and truth, has become the chair of pestilence now, casting everywhere just confusion and falsehood and false religion. So much so that because we breathe it in every day, we compromise with it, and we make our little discounts, we allow our discounts, and then we somehow we think that we manage to survive. But these feast days, these feast days sort of almost rise up out of the missal, and you can almost see St. Peter pointing his finger at you and saying, wait a minute, what kind of false doctrine have you gotten yourself into, you Mr. Traditionalist? Tu es Petrus, et superam Petram, edificabo ecclesiam meam. That's the Catholic faith. That's the Catholic truth. Don't bargain that away. You have no right to do that. Besides, you're not going to save the Catholic Church. God will save the Catholic Church in his own way. We don't need your formulae, your means to be able to sort of compromise away Catholicism somehow to make for something that will work. No. Let's just we don't have the backs on our chairs. We don't have the authority. Let's just keep what is passed down to us, the pure Catholic doctrine. Let's practice it in all charity as much as we can, and then let's go on with that. But truly, these feast days call upon a lot of the R&R people to do another R, which would be research, and then another R after that would be repentance. So I'm calling on the R&R people to become true R&Rs, researchers and repenters, for kind of like a New Year's resolution.
Absolutely, Your Excellency. And as we close the show, I think we can also, you and I both talked about that sort of sadness, but also I think there's a message of hope there, because for us, the institution of the papacy is what matters, not any particular personality. We've had bad popes before. We've had, we've had popes that have brought ignominy to that office before.
Mm-hmm.
Our times are no different from other times in the church, and so we have to put that in context and say, well, the institution, the chair endures despite the current so-called usurpers, I should say current usurpers, the so-called claimants.
Right. So we don't change our Catholic doctrine in order somehow to be able to fit everything into our global view of things. No. We've received our Catholic doctrine. We want to teach that to the next generation, and we want to live it today in this generation. So that means that we do recognize the chair of pestilence when we stumble onto it. But one thing,
chair of pestilence is a very, very strong phrase, Your Excellency.
It is a strong phrase. It's a scriptural phrase, and the phrase used by the fathers. And God knows it's true. I mean, how strongly is that true? And who? That's why we have to always be gentle in our estimations of our neighbor who may have fallen into the swamp of the R&R crowd. Just ignorance and superstition. You're just up to your thighs in it. Wow. But we have to be gentle at the same time, because people breathe this in. That's really all they know, and that's why you have to have these strong Catholic principles, and they're expressed in the liturgy. They're not ignored when they come up in the liturgy. Same thing with the Catechism. But it's very difficult to resist. It's a chair of pestilence. What's pestilence? Pestilence is a bug you get by just breathing it in. And everybody breathes in heresy, apostasy, and schism every day of the year. So people will tell you then seriously, well, you can't be an irredentist. Be realistic. You have to live in our world today. You have to make your accommodations, and we'll do our best. That was, perhaps. Some people say the idea of Paul VI with all of the changes. It was the idea of Archbishop Lefebvre, and a lot of the different plans that were proposed to him and that he agreed with to a certain degree before he finally rejected them, thank God, plans for a reconciliation with the conciliar church. No, we're not going to go along to get along. We don't have to. We're built on a rock, and we do indeed honor the chair. We honor the chair of St. Peter. We honor it way too much to be able to accept the substitute chair of pestilence. So I hope today's program maybe is like passing out gas masks to people so they don't breathe in the pestilence and don't fall ill themselves.
I think those points are well taken, Your Excellency, and I think that's a great note for us to end the show on. You have been listening to Restoration Radio, the opening of the second season. Our show topic today was the Chair of St. Peter, and our very distinguished, learned, and entertaining guest was His Excellency Bishop Daniel Dolan, who took some time before his mission trip this weekend to speak with us. Thank you so much for your time, Your Excellency. We're looking forward, obviously, to all your appearances in Season 2 of our show. They're always well received, and thanks again for your time. I know it's very valuable.
Thank you, Stephen. You're certainly welcome. It should be an interesting 2013. And I hope that.
Yeah, and we made it past the end of the world.
Indeed we did. So therefore, if we say the truth on the radio show, it won't be the end of the world, I think. We'll survive.
Thank you, Your Excellency.
God bless you.
Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
This program was brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org.